early Christian church was strange. It did not mesh well with its society. Our information about early Christianity overwhelmingly comes from Christian sources because Christians were the ones who cared about preserving these memories. But we do have a few Roman, that is, pagan, non-Christian sources that testify to this strangeness. For instance, one of our best outside sources about the early church comes from a little piece of imperial correspondence. It's a letter sent by Pliny the Younger, a governor in modern-day Turkey, to the Emperor Trajan. This letter was likely written in the early 2nd century, probably around the same time that the final books of the New Testament were being composed. The Romans didn't know quite what to do with the Christians because they saw them as a subversive political blight on the empire. When it came to religion, the Romans thought of themselves as quite pluralistic and tolerant, welcoming foreign gods into their own pantheon and allowing a wide range of religious practices, deities, and secretive mystery religions to operate all within the empire's domain. But Christians were different. It wasn't a problem with monotheism per se. Many of the Greek and Roman philosophers had argued for a form of monotheism, and the monotheistic Jewish sect, though never fully integrated into the empire, had worked out a tenuous acceptance with the Romans. But Christians burst the seams of Roman toleration. Jesus lived and the early church grew up in the 2-century span of what the Romans called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, where the empire reached its height of prosperity and power. But the hard bargain of the Pax Romana, how Rome maintained its power, was through a brutal dictatorial regime. Anyone who did not conform to the rigid hierarchical structure and the utter control of Caesar and the elite oligarchy around him could be beaten, imprisoned, and executed. In fact, beginning with Emperor Augustus, during the lifetime of Jesus himself, the Roman emperors, the Caesars, had inaugurated a new tradition of declaring themselves to be gods incarnate. Whether all the Caesars actually believed they were gods, whether they had all the constitutional powers they claimed to have, this was a very convenient piece of political propaganda, because all the occupants of the empire, whatever gods they might worship, were also required to worship Caesar. Look around the crowd. Anyone who isn't bowing the knee before the tyrant is suspected of being a dissident, a rebel against the imperial order. And Christians, as a rule, refused to bow to Caesar. Even more, the Christian belief system and practices didn't make any sense to the Roman powers that be. There were tens of thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of colonized occupants of the Roman Empire who were crucified. It was one of the Romans' favorite punishments for rebels and dissidents. But the Christians claimed that one in this swarm of crucified rebellious Jewish peasants was a god. What more, they didn't contain their bizarre beliefs to the already idiosyncratic Jewish sect, but were rapidly seducing Gentile and pagan, normal occupants of the empire into their messianic cult. When the Roman authorities articulated their complaints about the Christians at all, as Pliny does in his letter, these complaints might code as religious to our modern ears, but in context, these were political gripes. It wasn't that the Christians were violent or overtly rebellious. They just insisted on worshiping their crucified God and defying the deified emperor. Roman political leaders felt periodically obliged to persecute and drive people away from this rebellious ideology. In their correspondence, Emperor Trajan, Caesar, and Pliny agreed that there's no need for unnecessary bloodshed. Pliny would torture those accused of being Christians, but those Christians who renounce Christ, who become cowering subjects of empire, who literally bow in Pliny's presence before the Roman gods and before the idol of Caesar would be free to go. The Christians who refused to bow and scrape to Caesar's image and the Roman gods were to be summarily executed. Pliny specifically mentions torturing 2 female slaves who he says were called deaconesses. These women only add to poor Governor Pliny's befuddlement. Roman society was extremely hierarchical and rooted in power and dominance, with upper-class males like Pliny holding all the cards. Women were to be subservient to the male head in Roman households, and slaves, who made up close to a third of the local population in some parts of the empire, were the lowest of the low, not even human. Slaves were property, seen as carrying no more intrinsic value than the household's animals or tools. Yet here these 2 female slaves were recognized leaders, deaconesses in the absurd Christian faction, and they're defiantly unwilling to bow before Caesar. How dare they? But in a brief aside, Pliny actually describes what the tortured Christians are telling him about what it means to be a Christian. Quote, "They asserted, however, that the sum and substance of their fault or error had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God," end quote. This is part of the charge against the Christians. They gather early in the morning to sing dissident hymns about their crucified God. So what was in these hymns that the early Christians were willing to be tortured and die for? We get a hint about what these stubborn Christians might have been singing in our text this morning from Paul's letter to the Philippians, where most Bible scholars agree Paul actually slips into quoting an early church hymn in the middle of his thought. The rhymes and rhythms don't work as well in English, but if you pay attention, you hear Paul in his usual declarative exhortations, and suddenly, around verse 6, the text feels lyrical, measured, crafted. See if you can hear the change. I'll start in verse 3. "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." In the Philippians hymn, they sing of God descending down, down, down to humanity, slavery, and death by Roman execution, and then rising, rising, rising to the universal recognition of Jesus Christ as Lord. To the Roman way of thinking, this made absolutely zero sense. The point of having power was using it. Yet the hymn describes a God who gives up power, emptying God's self, refusing to exploit his privileges and power. The Greek verb empty here, kenosis, can also be translated as make void or nullify. Roman culture was rooted in dignity and power, violence and submission, honor and shame, and the slave was the bottommost rung on the cultural ladder. Emptying, nullifying oneself, becoming a slave voluntarily, these were the antitheses of Roman values. These were the kind of subversive, countercultural values that the early Christians were willing to die for. You can almost hear these slave women, deaconesses of the church, politely but obstinately telling the Roman governor, "Our God lowered himself, emptied himself. Our God became one of us. Our God was crucified on one of your Roman crosses. Therefore, we proclaim him as King of the universe. Our God descended to the lowest, and therefore we raise him to the highest." As the feisty theologian of the 4th century, Athanasius, put it, it is for God's degradation that we worship him. God has been a slave. God has seen the world from below. God is kindred to the poor, the dispossessed, the enslaved, the colonized, the trafficked, the racialized, the imprisoned, the oppressed, the deported. That's God's entry point into humanity. And when we recognize this, when we embrace this counterintuitive theology of God becoming the lowest of the low, it changes our whole view of the world order. If God be not a tyrant, how can any of us? If God refuses to exploit God's power, how can any of us exploit one another? In the logic of the early church, it was pretty simple. If Jesus is Lord, Caesar isn't. Caesar might have earthly power. He might control the government, might make the laws, might issue executive orders day and night, might assert his godlikeness. But for the Christians, if the one true God has become human, has become a slave like us, has taught us how valued and equal we are, then no human can claim to be a God over us, and no dictator can tell us who to worship. In fact, the subversiveness of the early church grew from there. They didn't just believe that God gave up power and cared for the lowest. They tried to imitate God's self-sacrifice. That is a lesson that Paul draws from the hymn, "Be like Jesus, not like Caesar. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others." God is not self-centered, so why should we be? God has become a slave, so as Jesus put it, greatness is to be found in being the slave of all. Like Jesus, we empty ourselves. We care for one another when the world around us gets dark and ugly, full of raw violence and the rage of imperial power. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when you have no political power is to live by a set of values that exposes the lie of the empire. Because the truth is, Caesar is just a weak, insecure human being like the rest of us. Caesar can tax us, punish us, give away our jobs, declare us unwanted, and strip away our rights. Caesar can install his incompetent cronies as governors and cabinet ministers over us. Caesar can claim to be divine and assert that the gods have put him on his throne to make Rome peaceful again, but we know the truth. God has walked among us. God is on the side not of tyrants, but of the oppressed and the poor. God has known slavery and has brought dignity to the lowest of the low. God has degraded God's self, and therefore we know who God really is. We see through the thin veil of Caesar's supposed power to what real power looks like. Real power is emptying yourself of ambition and conceit. Real power is never treating another human being as beneath you. Real power is sacrifice and service and kindness and compassion and love. Was the early church perfect? Certainly not. They had their squabbles and theological disputes. I don't think we are meant to idealize the early church. They were human beings, just like us, struggling to maintain faith in an often confusing and shockingly unfair world. But we can learn this from the early church. They were subversive, and they did not cower before tyrants. They would rise early in the morning, chanting their dissident hymns to Christ as to a God, trying to love their enemies, trying to pray for those who persecute them, but not bending the knee to Caesar's demand for their submission. Can you picture them? Enslaved women, deaconesses of the church, emboldened by the God who became a slave, standing before a red-faced tyrant and saying, "Our God isn't like you. Our God emptied himself to make us his own. Our God descends to the lowest, so we raise him to the highest. And we rise in the morning on a fixed day, and we sing a hymn to Christ as to a God. Kill us if you must,